Birth of a ship. Imagine standing on the raw edge of a New England shoreline in the year 1625. The salty Atlantic air cuts through the morning mist, and the rhythmic crash of waves against the rocky coast is broken by the sound of axes striking wood. Colonial shipbuilders, sunburnt, calloused, and dressed in rough wool and linen, are gathering timber that will soon form the skeleton of a vessel destined to carry goods, men, and ambition across the Atlantic world. This is the birth of a colonial ship, a process as demanding as it is symbolic. For the early colonists, ships were not luxuries, they were lifelines. A colony cut off from the sea was a colony doomed. Every nail, every plank, and every sail carried the weight of survival and prosperity. Timber, the bones of the ship. The first stage began deep in the colonial forests. Vast oak and pine forests stretched endlessly across New England and the Chesapeake. Unlike England, where timber supplies were dwindling, the New World seemed inexhaustible. Colonists felled giant white oaks for the keel, the central spine of the ship, because oak was both tough and resistant to rot. Tall, straight pines became masts that could tower over 100 feet, reaching toward the heavens like cathedral spires. Felling trees was brutal work. Axes bit into trunks, and sawyers worked long hours to square timbers by hand. The chosen wood had to season, dry slowly to prevent warping, sometimes for months before it could be shaped into the ship's frame. Every tree carried purpose: oak, keel, ribs, and planking; pine, masts and spars; cedar, resistant to decay, often for smaller parts; maple and birch, interior fittings. Colonial forests became shipyards before the keel ever touched water. Shipyards and craftsmanship. By the mid-1600s, bustling shipyards sprang up in towns like Boston, Salem, and Portsmouth. Here, communities gathered to witness ships take form. Shipwrights were master craftsmen, half engineers, half artists. Their knowledge was inherited from Europe, but adapted to New World conditions. A typical colonial shipyard was noisy, crowded, and smelled of pine tar, sawdust, and sweat. Apprentices hauled timber, blacksmiths hammered nails and anchors, and caulkers sealed seams with hemp and tar to keep the vessel watertight. Key roles in construction: shipwrights, the designers, often using rough sketches and memory rather than precise blueprints. Caulkers filled the seams with oakum, hemp fibers soaked in tar. Mast makers shaped towering pines into smooth, rounded masts. Rope makers twisted hemp into miles of rigging. The work was dangerous. A miscut timber could doom an entire project. A snapped rope could maim a man. And yet, each vessel carried with it the hopes of merchants, fishermen, and colonists who depended on the sea for connection to the wider world. The design of colonial ships. Colonial vessels varied in type depending on their mission. Shallops, small boats for fishing and coastal trade. Ketches and sloops, versatile single-mast vessels used for local commerce. Brigs and brigantines, two-masted ships, often for longer voyages. Merchantmen and galleons, large ocean-going cargo ships built for the transatlantic run. Unlike the massive, ornate galleons of Spain, colonial ships leaned toward practicality. They had sleeker hulls for speed, sturdy keels for rough Atlantic crossings, and broader cargo holds for tobacco, fish, and furs. What they lacked in grandeur, they made up in resilience. These ships were workhorses, built to endure storms, pirates, and years at sea. Ritual of launching. Once complete, launching a ship was both a technical feat and a spiritual one. Communities often gathered for the event. Ministers prayed, families cheered, and the shipwrights themselves, exhausted but proud, watched as their creation slid into the sea for the first time. It was customary to christen the ship with a name that reflected hope or divine blessing. The blessing of the bay, the Mayflower, the Adventure, the Fortune. A bottle, sometimes of wine, sometimes of water, was smashed against the bow in ritual dedication. As the hull kissed saltwater, cheers erupted. But beneath the celebration was sobering truth. The ocean could just as easily claim a ship as carry it to fortune. Why ships mattered. Ships were not just transport. They were arteries of the colonial body. They carried food from Europe to starving colonies. They exported tobacco, fish, furs, and lumber back to England. They enabled migration, bringing new settlers, families, and indentured servants. They transported ideas, letters, and cultures that shaped early America. Without ships, there would be no colonies. The wooden vessels built on colonial shores connected the raw wilderness of the New World to the bustling markets of London, the sugar islands of the Caribbean, and the gold-rich ports of Spain. For every colonial farmer who tilled the land, there was a shipbuilder shaping timber. For every merchant dreaming of wealth, there was a vessel waiting in harbour. For every colonist gazing across the sea, there was a wooden promise floating on the horizon. In the 1600s, to build a ship was to build a future. Each plank hammered into place, each sail raised against the wind, each name painted on a hull was a declaration that the colonies were not isolated outposts, but part of a global struggle for power, trade, and survival. The story of colonial America begins not only with plows in the soil, but with ships in the water. Life at sea. The creak of timber, the snap of canvas, the cry of gulls fading into distance. Once the ship slid free of the harbour and the coastline dwindled to a line on the horizon, a new world began, a floating one. To live aboard a colonial ship in the 1600s was to surrender to the sea's moods, its calm, its fury, and its endless horizon. Here, every man had a role, every rope had a name, and every day was measured by the roll of the waves and the turn of the stars. Navigation, finding the way. Across a trackless ocean. The Atlantic was vast and merciless, and in the 1600s, navigation was a delicate blend of skill, superstition, and luck. Colonists relied on tools that seemed primitive by modern eyes. Compass, steady needle pointing north, the sailor's most faithful guide. Astrolabe and cross staff, instruments to measure the sun's angle or the height of the North Star, revealing latitude. Hourglasses, sand falling through glass to measure the watches of the day and night. Dead reckoning, plotting distance by speed, guessed currents and time, often more art than science. Captains read the sky like a book. Clouds, wind shifts, and bird migrations offered signs of land or storm. But even the most skilled navigator could be led astray. Entire fleets were lost on hidden reefs or pushed far off course by relentless winds. To the crew, every sunrise was a question. Are we where we think we are? The crew and hierarchy life at sea was defined by discipline. The ship was a small society, and order meant survival. The captain, absolute authority, master of ship and men. His word was law. First mate, second in command, overseeing rigging, sails, and daily operations. Boatswain, bosun, in charge of ropes, anchors, and maintenance, feared for his strictness. Carpenter and sailmaker, essential tradesmen. A broken mast or torn sail could mean doom without them. Cook, working in a smoky galley, serving hardtack, salted pork, and dried peas. Common sailors, the muscle of the ship, climbing rigging, hauling ropes, scrubbing decks, braving storms. Punishments were brutal. A sailor caught stealing could be whipped, chained, or even marooned. Laziness, disobedience, or mutiny was unthinkable in the confined, dangerous world of the ship. Still, camaraderie bound men together. Songs, jokes, and shared hardship created bonds as strong as the ropes they handled. Food and daily life. Onboard meals were plain, repetitive, and often foul. Sailors lived on hardtack, rock-hard biscuits, often crawling with weevils, salted pork and beef, tough and briny, peas, beans, and oats, filling but monotonous, beer or watered wine, safer than drinking seawater. Fresh food spoiled within days. Water turned stale and slimy in barrels. A lemon or onion was a rare treasure, often hoarded for the captain's table. Daily routines were broken into watches, 4-hour shifts rotating day and night. Men hauled ropes, adjusted sails, scrubbed decks, repaired lines, or simply kept lookout. Sleep was snatched in hammocks below deck, cramped and swaying with the ship's rhythm, the air thick with tar, sweat, and unwashed clothes. Rats scurried in the dark. Lice and fleas were constant companions. And yet, the sea offered moments of awe, glowing plankton trailing behind at night, dolphins leaping alongside the bow, sunsets that painted the horizon in gold and crimson, storms and the wrath of nature. Few experiences were as terrifying as a storm at sea. When black clouds piled on the horizon and winds howled, the crew scrambled to reef sails, secure lines, and brace for chaos. Waves towered higher than houses, crashing over the deck, sweeping men away. Lightning split the sky, thunder shook the timbers, and the ship groaned like a living thing under strain. In such moments, survival was prayer and discipline. The captain shouted orders drowned by wind, the boatswain's whistle pierced through chaos, and every hand clung to ropes as the ship pitched like a toy. Storms could last hours or days. Sometimes a ship emerged battered but afloat. Other times, only splinters were left to mark where she once sailed. Faith, fear, and sailors' superstitions. To survive at sea, men turned to faith and ritual. Sailors believed in omens. A red sunrise warned of danger. An albatross brought luck. Killing one brought doom. Whistling on deck was said to summon storms. Every voyage began with prayers, and often a minister was on board. But when prayers failed, men clung to charms, carvings, or songs to keep courage alive. Shanties echoed across the decks, voices blending with the rhythm of ropes and wind. Music was both labor and lifeline. Encounters at sea days could stretch into monotony, endless horizon, the same creak of timbers. Then, suddenly, excitement. A distant sail on the horizon, friend or foe, whales surfacing beside the ship, their breath like steam engines in the cold air. Floating wreckage, grim sign of disaster ahead. Landfall after months, the shout of "Land ho!" was enough to bring men weeping with relief. The sea was never truly empty. It was alive with danger, mystery, and possibility. To live at sea was to gamble with nature. Sailors endured hunger, storms, disease, and the lash. They worked in rhythm with wind and tide, bound by discipline, faith, and desperation. Yet for all its dangers, the sea offered something greater: freedom, fortune, and the promise of reaching lands that could change a man's destiny. On the open Atlantic, every ship was a floating world, fragile but determined, carrying not just goods or passengers, but the very survival of the colonies themselves. Danger on the waters. Out on the Atlantic, a ship was never truly safe. The greatest danger wasn't only the storms or the hunger, it was other men. Colonial ships carried goods, resources, and hope for survival. That meant they also carried temptation. For pirates, privateers, and rival nations, those wooden vessels were floating treasure chests, and every journey risked attack. To sail in the 1600s was to accept that danger lived beyond the horizon. 1. The threat of pirates were no romantic figures in the colonial age. They were predators of the sea. Bands of desperate men in fast, shallow draft ships hunted the slower merchant vessels of the colonies. They struck along shipping lanes where colonial goods, tobacco, sugar, timber, or salted fish, were carried toward Europe or the Caribbean. Their methods were terrifyingly simple. Pirates relied on speed, surprise, and fear. They fired warning shots from cannons or muskets, their blackened sails closing in quickly. The crew of a colonial merchantman might try to flee, but if the wind favored the pirate, resistance was short-lived. Once grapple hooks sank into the rail, combat spilled onto the deck. Captured sailors faced a cruel choice: join the pirate crew or lose their lives. To colonial captains, pirates weren't swashbuckling adventurers, they were ruthless thieves who could strip a ship of its cargo and leave its crew destitute, or worse, dead. 2. Naval warfare and rival powers. Beyond pirates, the sea was also a battlefield between empires. In the 1600s, England, Spain, France, and the Netherlands were locked in constant competition. Colonists carried not only their livelihoods across the Atlantic, but also the ambitions of their nations. An English ship might suddenly find itself chased by a French privateer, a government-licensed pirate authorized to attack enemy vessels. For sailors, the difference between pirate and privateer was meaningless. The threat was the same: cannons roaring, splintered wood flying, and muskets cracking across the decks. Naval combat in the 1600s was brutal. Ships exchanged broadsides at close range, iron cannonballs smashing through timber, scattering splinters like deadly shards. Smoke choked the air, making it hard to see, while crews scrambled to reload, patch leaks, and tend to the wounded. The deck became a place of chaos, fire, blood, and shouted commands mingling with the roar of the sea. 3. Defenses and survival tactics. Colonial merchant ships weren't designed for war, but survival demanded preparation. Captains carried small cannons, swivel guns, and muskets. The crew drilled in repelling borders, setting up barricades on deck with barrels and crates. When danger appeared, every man was expected to fight. Sailors poured buckets of sand across the deck to prevent slipping in blood. Powder kegs were guarded closely to prevent a stray spark from turning the vessel into an inferno. If a boarding seemed inevitable, the crew braced themselves with cutlasses, boarding pikes, and whatever tools could serve as weapons. Some captains relied on deception. They might fly false flags to confuse enemies, pretending to be Spanish or Dutch until danger passed. Others sailed in convoys, hoping that safety lay in numbers. But out on the open sea, a single ship often stood alone, and its survival depended on discipline, quick thinking, and raw courage. 4. The aftermath of battle. Whether the enemy was pirate or rival navy, the aftermath was grim. Survivors stumbled among shattered timbers and torn sails. The deck stank of blood and gunpowder. Wounded men moaned as the ship's surgeon, armed with little more than knives, saws, and boiling pitch, worked frantically to save lives. Amputations were common, infection almost certain. If victorious, the crew salvaged what they could, patching sails, plugging holes, and throwing the dead to the sea. Victory brought relief, but rarely joy. Each encounter reminded them that survival was fragile. Every ship that left port knew it might never return. 5. The human fear of the horizon. The greatest weapon pirates or navies wielded was fear. A dark sail on the horizon could turn men's stomachs cold. Whispered rumors of pirate havens in the Caribbean or of Spanish warships prowling the Gulf haunted sailors at night. For colonists, the sea promised trade, survival, and a link to the wider world. But it also promised danger. Every voyage carried the weight of uncertainty. Men prayed before setting sail, knowing that wind, weather, and war might conspire against them. To survive the Atlantic was not only a feat of seamanship, it was an act of faith and endurance. Colonial life was carved out on land, but it was defended and sustained on water. Ships were lifelines, yet they were also targets. To sail the seas of the 1600s was to live with constant danger, balancing hope against fear, fortune against risk. For the men who braved the Atlantic, every horizon carried both promise and peril. Cargoes of empire, why ships mattered. Every plank of a colonial ship told a story. But it was what those ships carried that changed the world. Without them, the colonies would have starved, trade would have withered, and empires would never have risen. The ship was not only a machine of wood and sail, it was the artery of survival, commerce, and power in the 1600s. 1. What colonial ships carried. Colonial ships carried more than cargo. They carried life itself. From the American coast, holds were stacked with barrels of salted fish, timber, tobacco, rice, and furs. These were the products of the New World, raw goods that Europe craved. In return, ships brought textiles, tools, iron, gunpowder, sugar, wine, and enslaved Africans forced into the colonies. The layout of a cargo hold was cramped and dark. Barrels of salted pork and dried peas might be wedged beside stacks of hides or crates of beaver pelts. The smell was overwhelming. Salt, tar, mold, and sweat blending together. Yet without those supplies, the colonies could not grow. Ships turned wilderness settlements into functioning societies by carrying what could not be made locally. 2. Supply routes and lifelines. Colonial ships followed dangerous but essential trade routes. From New England, ships sailed south to the Caribbean, exchanging timber and salted fish for sugar and molasses. Others crossed the Atlantic, bringing colonial tobacco to English ports like London and Bristol, then returning with clothing, iron tools, and weapons. Every route was a lifeline. A failed voyage could mean starvation for a settlement or bankruptcy for a merchant. Colonists waited at harbors with anxious eyes, knowing a single ship's arrival could bring letters from home, barrels of food, or much-needed medicines. To lose a ship to storm or pirate was not just an economic blow. It was a human tragedy. 3. Global connections. By the 1600s, colonial ships had stitched the New World into a web of global trade. Furs from New England ended up in Paris hats. Virginia tobacco was smoked in taverns from London to Amsterdam. Sugar from the Caribbean sweetened tea in English drawing rooms. Ships also tied the colonies to Africa through the brutal triangular trade. human beings were chained in African ports, forced across the Middle Passage to the Americas, and sold into bondage. Those same ships then carried colonial goods back to Europe. In this way, the wooden vessels of the colonies became engines of both wealth and human suffering. 4. The daily reality of cargo transport loading. A ship was a grueling process. Sailors and dock workers rolled heavy barrels down gangplanks, lifted crates by block and tackle, and packed the hold until barely a hand's width remained between items. Precision was vital. Too much weight on one side, and the ship might capsize in rough seas. During voyages, the crew constantly checked the cargo. Barrels shifted as waves struck, ropes strained, and leaks had to be patched with oakum and pitch. Rats gnawed at food supplies, and mold spread in the damp dark. Yet even with losses, the goods that survived meant profit for merchants and survival for colonists. 5. The symbol of ships in the colonial world. Beyond their practical purpose, ships carried meaning. For colonists, the sight of sails on the horizon was the sight of connection, proof they were not alone in the wilderness. Ships brought news of wars in Europe, the rise and fall of kings, and rumors of opportunity in distant lands. For empires, ships symbolized power. To control the seas was to control the flow of wealth. A single well-armed vessel could project dominance across oceans, while fleets became floating walls of empire. Every mast that rose above a harbor represented ambition and survival. 6. Why ships mattered. Without ships, there would have been no colonies. They carried settlers across the Atlantic, food into hungry ports, trade goods into Europe, and power into the hands of those who controlled them. They were lifelines in wood and canvas, fragile yet indispensable. Ships were also symbols of risk. Each departure meant trusting timber, rope, and wind to carry lives across thousands of miles. Each return was a victory not only for crew and captain, but for the fragile dream of the colonies themselves. The story of colonial America is inseparable from the story of its ships. They were the bridges of the 1600s, connecting distant worlds, fueling ambition, and shaping history one voyage at a time. When we imagine the early colonies, we think of fields, cabins, and towns. But none of those could exist without the vessels that stitched the old world to the new. To understand how America began, we must look not only at the land, but to the sea, and to the ships that carried hope, hardship, and history across the horizon.